In 1992, 17 students boarded a school bus in Pinewood, Oregon, for what should have been an ordinary Monday morning commute. They never arrived at school. The bus, the driver, and all 17 teenagers vanished without a trace, leaving behind 17 families with questions that would haunt them for more than 3 decades. But when construction workers demolish an abandoned water treatment facility in 2025, they discover something that makes every parent in Pinewood realize their worst nightmares were far more horrifying than they ever imagined. If you're drawn to mysteries that delve into the darkest corners of human nature, subscribe and join us as we uncover the truth. The morning of November 9th, 1992, dawned cold and gray over Pinewood, Oregon. Helen Rothman stood at her kitchen window, watching her daughter Brianna zip up her navy jacket against the autumn chill. 17 years old, a senior at Pinewood High School, Brianna had her whole future mapped out. University applications submitted, scholarship essays polished, dreams of becoming a veterinarian just within reach. "Mom, I'm late," Brianna called, grabbing her backpack from the kitchen chair. Helen turned from the window, noting how her daughter's blonde hair caught the pale morning light. "Did you pack your lunch?" "Yes, and before you ask, yes, I have my chemistry homework." Brianna rolled her eyes with the easy affection of a teenager who knew she was loved. She kissed her mother's cheek quickly. "Bus is probably already at the corner. Love you." "Love you too, sweetheart. Have a good day." Those were the last words Helen ever spoke to her daughter. By noon, 17 families in Pinewood would be making frantic phone calls to the school, to each other, to the police. By evening, search parties would comb the forests surrounding the town, their flashlights cutting through the gathering darkness. By the next morning, news vans from Portland would crowd the small town square, reporters asking questions no one could answer. How does a school bus vanish? How do 17 young people and their driver simply cease to exist on a route they'd traveled hundreds of times before? For 33 years, Pinewood held its breath, waiting for answers that never came. The families aged. Some moved away, others stayed, unable to leave the last place their children had been seen alive. The town became known for its tragedy, a place people whispered about, a cautionary tale without a moral. Helen Rothman never left. She couldn't. Every morning she still stood at that same kitchen window, looking out at the corner where her daughter had caught the bus that final time. Waiting. Hoping. Refusing to believe that Brianna was truly gone forever. She would wait 33 years before learning the truth. And when it finally came, Helen would wish she had never known at all. The demolition of the old Pinewood water treatment facility began on a Tuesday morning in March 2025. The building had been abandoned for nearly 40 years, a relic from the 1970s that the town had simply built around, ignoring its decaying presence on the eastern edge of town. Now, with new development plans approved, the massive concrete structure was finally coming down. Helen Rothman, now 72 years old, heard the distant boom of the first explosion from her kitchen. She paused while pouring her morning coffee, the sound triggering memories she'd spent decades trying to manage. Every loud noise, every unexpected sound, still made her think of Brianna. Still made her wonder if this would be the day someone found something. The phone rang at 10:47 a.m. Helen was in her garden, tending to the roses Brianna had helped her plant the spring before she disappeared. She almost didn't hear it over the continued rumble of machinery from across town. "Mrs. Rothman?" The voice on the other end was young, male, uncertain. "This is Officer Kevin Marsh with the Pinewood Police Department. Detective Vance would like to speak with you. Would you be able to come to the station?" Helen's heart constricted, the way it had thousands of times over the past 33 years. Every phone call could be the one. Every knock on the door could bring answers. "Has something been found?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady. A pause. "Detective Vance will explain everything. Can you come down to the station? Or we can send a car." "I'll drive myself." The Pinewood police station occupied the same small brick building it had since 1965. Helen had walked through its doors more times than she could count, reporting Brianna missing that first terrible night, attending updates on the investigation, demanding answers as the years stretched on and the case grew cold. She knew every crack in the linoleum, every water stain on the ceiling tiles. Detective Sarah Vance was waiting in the lobby. Helen had never met her before. Vance had transferred to Pinewood only 5 years ago, long after most people had stopped actively investigating the case of the missing bus. She was in her early 40s, with sharp brown eyes and an expression that Helen recognized immediately. It was the look of someone who had seen something they couldn't unsee. "Mrs. Rothman, thank you for coming so quickly." Vance extended her hand, her grip firm but not aggressive. "Please, come to my office." The office was small, cramped with file boxes and a desk covered in papers. Vance closed the door before speaking, and Helen felt her chest tighten with anticipation. "The construction crew at the old water treatment facility found something this morning," Vance began, choosing her words carefully. "During the demolition of the lower levels, they broke through into a section of the building that wasn't on any of the original blueprints, a basement level that appears to have been sealed off and forgotten." Helen gripped the arms of her chair. "And?" Vance's jaw tightened. "They found a school bus, Mrs. Rothman. A 1987 Bluebird conventional. License plate matches the one that disappeared in 1992. The room seemed to tilt. Helen heard a sound like rushing water in her ears. 33 years. 33 years of wondering, and the bus had been less than 3 miles from where it disappeared. Less than 3 miles from her home. "The students?" Helen whispered. Vance's expression was carefully controlled, but Helen saw the darkness in her eyes. "The forensic team is still processing the scene. It's complex. But Mrs. Rothman, I need you to understand something. What they found inside that facility, it's not just a recovery site. It appears to have been deliberately constructed to hold the bus. This wasn't an accident or even a simple abduction. This was planned, engineered." Helen's hands began to shake. "Someone built a prison for them?" "We're still determining exactly what happened. But yes, it appears the lower level of that facility was modified specifically to contain the bus and—" Vance hesitated. "And to keep people alive for an extended period." The implications crashed over Helen like a physical wave. Her daughter hadn't died quickly in an accident. Brianna had been held somewhere, trapped, possibly for days or weeks or longer. Suffering. "I need to see it," Helen said, her voice cracking. "That's not possible right now. The scene is still being processed, and honestly, Mrs. Rothman, it's not something any parent should have to witness. What I can tell you is that we're treating this as an active crime scene. We've called in additional resources from the state police. The FBI has been notified. This is now the largest criminal investigation in Oregon history." Helen barely heard her. Her mind was stuck on a single, terrible image. Brianna, 17 years old, trapped in darkness, wondering why no one was coming to save her. "Who did this?" Helen asked. "Who could do something like this?" Vance leaned forward, her voice dropping. "That's what we need to find out. And Mrs. Rothman, I'm going to need your help. You've kept Brianna's case alive for 33 years. You know details that might have been forgotten or overlooked. I need you to remember everything you can about that morning, about the days leading up to it, about anything unusual that might have happened." Helen nodded slowly, forcing herself to focus. For 33 years, she had waited for this moment, the moment when someone would finally take her seriously again, when someone would finally dig for the truth. "There's one more thing," Vance said, her voice even more careful now. "The construction crew found something else in that basement. Documents, files, and Mrs. Rothman, they suggest that what happened to those 17 students wasn't random. Someone selected them specifically." The news broke across Oregon by evening. Every major network carried the story. Missing school bus found after 33 years. Pinewood tragedy may have been deliberate abduction. By nightfall, satellite trucks clogged the streets around the old water treatment facility, their lights illuminating the police tape and armed guards now surrounding the demolition site. Helen sat in her living room, the television muted, watching the familiar faces of Brianna's classmates flash across the screen. 17 smiling teenagers, frozen forever at 16, 17, 18 years old. The news had pulled yearbook photos, school portraits, candid shots from proud parents. Each face a life stolen, a future erased. Her doorbell began ringing at 6 p.m. Reporters, she assumed, and she ignored them. But at 7:30, when the knocking persisted, she finally opened the door to find a woman in her early 50s, her face vaguely familiar. "Mrs. Rothman, I'm Diane Foster. My son Nathan was on that bus." Helen remembered now. Nathan Foster had been a sophomore, quiet, an artist who always carried a sketchbook. Diane had been at many of the same vigils, the same press conferences, the same desperate organizing meetings in those early years. "Come in," Helen said, stepping aside. Within an hour, 7 more parents had arrived. They clustered in Helen's living room, a support group reformed after years of dissolution. Some had stayed in Pinewood. Others had driven hours after hearing the news. They all looked older, grayer, worn down by decades of grief. But in their eyes, Helen saw the same desperate hope that burned in her own chest. The detective said they found files, offered Raymond Kirk, whose daughter Ashley had been a senior. Files suggesting the kids were specifically selected. "What does that mean?" "I don't know," Helen admitted. "But Detective Vance is coming by tomorrow morning to update us all. She promised to keep us informed as the investigation progresses." "After 33 years of silence," Diane said bitterly, "now they want to talk." Helen understood the anger. The initial investigation in 1992 had been thorough, but ultimately fruitless. The FBI had been involved then, too, combing through the woods, dredging the Columbia River, interviewing everyone in town. They'd found nothing. No tire tracks, no witnesses, no forensic evidence. The bus had simply vanished between the last residential pickup point and the school, a distance of only 2 miles. Eventually, the investigation had cooled. Then frozen. The families had been left with grief counselors and cold case detectives who called once a year, if that. "They found the bus less than 3 miles from where it disappeared," said Marcus Webb, father of twins Joel and Erica. His voice shook with barely contained rage. 3 miles? How did we search this entire town, this entire county, and miss a whole basement level of that facility?" "Because it wasn't on the blueprints," Helen said quietly. "Detective Vance said it was deliberately hidden. Someone went to enormous lengths to create that space without anyone knowing." The room fell silent as the implications settled over. Them. This hadn't been an opportunistic crime. Someone had planned this for months, maybe years. Someone had modified a public building, creating a secret prison, and then enacted a complex abduction that required precise timing and knowledge of the school bus route. "The driver," Raymond said suddenly. "Thomas Garrett. He was 53 years old, had driven that route for 12 years. Perfect record. Everyone trusted him. What if—" "The police investigated him thoroughly," Helen interrupted. "His family was devastated. They lost him too." But what if he was involved? Raymond pressed. What if he was working with someone? It's the only explanation for how the bus went off route without any of the kids raising an alarm. Helen had thought about this countless times over the years. Brianna was smart, cautious. If something had seemed wrong, she would have noticed, unless she'd trusted whoever was leading them astray. A soft knock interrupted the conversation. Helen opened the door to find Detective Vance standing on her porch, her expression grave. "I apologize for the intrusion," Vance said, noting the gathered parents. "Actually, this might be better. I have an update, and you all deserve to hear it." The living room fell silent as Vance entered and remained standing, her hands clasped in front of her. "The forensic team has completed their initial survey of the site," she began. "I won't sugarcoat this. What we found is deeply disturbing. The basement level was approximately 8,000 square feet, subdivided into multiple rooms. The bus was parked in the largest space, which appears to have been fitted with basic utilities: water, electricity, ventilation." Helen felt Diane grip her hand. "The configuration suggests the space was designed to be inhabited. There are signs of long-term occupation. We found personal belongings, makeshift bedding, evidence of food storage." Vance's voice remained professional, but her hands trembled slightly. "We also found 17 bodies." The room erupted in gasps and sobs. Helen felt the floor drop away beneath her. 33 years of hoping, of imagining Brianna might somehow still be alive somewhere, vanished in an instant. "How long?" Marcus whispered. "How long were they alive down there?" Vance's jaw clenched. "The forensic analysis will take time, but preliminary examination suggests they survived for a significant period. Weeks, possibly months. The medical examiner is working to determine exact causes and times of death, but it appears they had access to food, water, and basic necessities." "Who did this?" Diane's voice was raw. "Who would keep children alive in a basement prison?" "That's what we're trying to determine. The documents we found include detailed records, schedules, observations, what appear to be experiment logs." Helen's blood ran cold. "Experiments?" Vance hesitated, clearly weighing how much to reveal. "The person who created that facility kept meticulous notes about the students, behavioral observations, psychological profiles, reactions to various stimuli. This wasn't just an abduction, Mrs. Rothman. This was systematic, organized, the work of someone with extensive planning and resources." "Someone in this town," Raymond said flatly. "Someone who knew these kids, knew the bus route, had access to that facility." "We're investigating all possibilities," Vance said. "The water treatment plant closed in 1986, 6 years before the abduction. During that time, it was technically city property but largely forgotten. We're pulling employment records, maintenance logs, anyone who might have had access." Helen's mind raced through the possibilities. Pinewood in 1992 had been a small town of about 8,000 people. Everyone knew everyone. The idea that one of their neighbors, someone they'd passed at the grocery store or sat next to at church, could be responsible for this horror was almost too much to process. "There's one more thing," Vance said, and her expression darkened further. "Among the documents we found a list, 17 names, with detailed background information on each student, family situations, academic performance, personality traits, daily routines. But there was an 18th name on that list, crossed out." The room went very still. "Someone was selected but not taken?" Marcus asked. "We're trying to identify who that might have been. The name was heavily redacted in the documents, but we're working with handwriting analysts and digital enhancement. If we can determine who that 18th student was, they might remember something crucial. Someone asking unusual questions, someone showing abnormal interest in their schedule." As Vance continued talking about the investigation's next steps, Helen's gaze drifted to the window. Outside, Pinewood looked the same as it always had. Quiet streets, familiar houses. The kind of town where people still left their doors unlocked and knew their neighbors' names. But beneath that peaceful surface, something monstrous had been hiding for 33 years. And Helen couldn't shake the feeling that it was still hiding, still watching, waiting to see if anyone would finally uncover the whole terrible truth. Detective Vance returned to Helen's house the following morning with a laptop and a cardboard file box that looked decades old. The sun had barely risen, casting pale light across the kitchen table where they sat. "I need to show you something," Vance said, opening the laptop. "But I want to warn you first. Some of what we found in those documents is extremely difficult to process." Helen straightened in her chair, steeling herself. "I've spent 33 years imagining the worst." "Show me." Vance pulled up a scanned image of a handwritten page, the ink faded but still legible. The handwriting was neat, almost clinical in its precision. At the top of the page, a date, September 15th, 1992, nearly 2 months before the abduction. "This appears to be a planning document," Vance explained. "The author is observing the potential targets, taking notes on their behaviors and routines." Helen leaned closer, reading the entries. Her breath caught when she found Brianna's name. Subject 12, Brianna Rothman, age 17, senior, high academic achievement, particular strength in sciences, lives with single mother, father deceased 1989. Regular schedule, consistent bus pickup at 7:42 a.m., Tuesday, Friday. Socially well-adjusted but maintains close friendship circle rather than broad popularity. Demonstrates leadership qualities in group settings, strong moral compass, protective of younger students, ideal candidate for behavioral study. Helen's hands trembled as she read the cold, detached assessment of her daughter. Behavioral study. What does that mean? "We're still analyzing the complete documents, but it appears whoever did this was conducting some kind of psychological experiment. They wanted to observe how the students would behave in an isolated, controlled environment." Vance scrolled to another page, this one dated November 10th, 1992, the day after the abduction. Day 1. All subjects secured. Initial panic response as anticipated. Subject 12, Rothman, has emerged as natural leader, attempting to calm younger subjects. Subject 7, Foster, N., showing signs of shock, unresponsive. Driver, Garrett, more problematic than predicted. Physical restraint necessary. Subjects beginning to understand their situation. Fear levels optimal for baseline observation. Helen felt bile rise in her throat. She forced herself to keep reading as Vance scrolled through page after page of clinical observations. The entries continued for weeks, documenting the students' deteriorating psychological states, their attempts to escape, their growing despair. "The author kept records for approximately 4 months, Vance said quietly. The entries become less frequent toward the end, more sporadic. The final entry is dated March 3rd, 1993. Helen couldn't speak. 4 months. Brianna had survived down there for 4 months, trapped in darkness, slowly losing hope. "There's something else," Vance said, her voice careful. "The documents reference observation windows and controlled interventions. We found evidence in the basement of a separate room, sealed behind a false wall. We believe the perpetrator would enter this room to watch the students without their knowledge." "A viewing room," Helen whispered. "They were being watched." "Yes, and periodically the author would introduce what they called stressors, removing food supplies, cutting power, playing sounds over a speaker system. They were documenting the psychological breakdown methodically." Helen pushed back from the table, moving to the window. Outside, Pinewood was waking up. She could see neighbors leaving for work, children waiting at bus stops. Normal life continuing, oblivious to the horror that had festered beneath their town for over 3 decades. "The 18th name," Helen said, turning back to Vance. Have you identified them yet? Vance hesitated. We're working on it. The name was deliberately obscured, but our analysts have enhanced the underlying indentations in the paper. They believe the name is Jennifer Hartley, but we haven't been able to locate anyone by that name in Pinewood's 1992 records. Maybe it's a married name now, Helen suggested. Or maybe they moved away before the abduction happened. We're checking into that. I've also been reviewing the list of students who were supposed to be on that bus but weren't. There were 3. Marcus Webb's son, Joel, was homesick that day, Ashley Kirk had a dentist appointment, and a student named Trevor Moss had overslept. Vance paused. Of those 3, only Joel and Ashley were on the target list. Trevor Moss wasn't included in the planning documents at all. Helen frowned. So the perpetrator knew Joel would be absent? It's possible. The documents show detailed knowledge of each family's routines and schedules. Whoever this was, they had access to intimate information about these families. A chill ran down Helen's spine. Someone close to us. Someone we knew. That's our working theory. The level of detail in these observations suggests regular, sustained surveillance over months. This person saw these children frequently, knew their habits, possibly interacted with them directly. Helen thought back to 1992, trying to remember who had been present in Brianna's life. Teachers, coaches, neighbors, family friends. The list was long, and after 33 years, memories had faded and blurred. There's one more thing I need to show you, Vance said, pulling a photograph from the file box. We found this tucked inside one of the journals. The photograph showed the interior of the basement facility, but it hadn't been taken by the forensics team. The image was old, the colors faded in the way of photographs from the 1990s. It showed the school bus parked in the large central room, emergency lights casting an eerie glow. And standing in front of the bus, barely visible in the dim light, was a figure in dark clothing, face obscured by shadows. This was taken shortly after the abduction, Vance said. The perpetrator documented their work. We found several more photographs, but this is the only one that shows a human figure. Helen studied the image, searching for any identifying details. The person was average height, average build, could be male or female. No distinguishing features visible. Our technical team is trying to enhance the image, pull any additional details from the shadows. But I wanted you to see it because of what's written on the back. Vance turned the photograph over. In the same neat handwriting as the journals, a single sentence. The perfect subjects, preserved in their perfect moment. Helen felt something cold settle in her chest. Preserved. Like specimens. That's how this person viewed them, not as human beings but as subjects for study. The psychological profile we're developing suggests someone with clinical detachment, possibly medical or scientific training, someone who could rationalize this as research rather than murder. A doctor? Helen asked. A psychologist? Possibly. We're pulling records of anyone in Pinewood in 1992 with relevant professional backgrounds, but it could also be someone self-taught, someone who developed an obsessive interest in behavioral psychology. Helen's phone rang, breaking the tension. She answered to find Diane Foster on the other end, her voice tight with urgency. Helen, turn on the news. Channel 7. Right now. Helen fumbled for the remote, switching on the small television mounted under her kitchen cabinets. The morning news was showing aerial footage of the water treatment facility. Yellow crime scene tape cordoned off a much larger area than before, and she could see multiple forensic tents erected around the site. The news anchor's voice cut through. Breaking developments in the Pinewood school bus case. Officials confirm they have found a second chamber beneath the water treatment facility. Details are still emerging, but sources close to the investigation suggest this discovery may indicate there were more victims than initially believed. Vance's phone buzzed insistently. She answered, listened for a moment, then stood abruptly. I have to go. There's been a development at the site." "What did they find?" Helen demanded. Vance's expression was grim. "Another room, and it wasn't empty." By noon, the entire town of Pinewood had descended into chaos. News of the second chamber spread rapidly, fueling speculation and panic. Parents who had children in school in 1992 flooded the police station with calls, demanding to know if their children had been on the target list. The mayor called an emergency town hall meeting for that evening. Helen found herself unable to stay home. She drove to the water treatment facility, joining the growing crowd of onlookers held back by police barriers. News vans lined the street, reporters doing live updates with the crumbling facility looming behind them. She spotted Detective Vance emerging from one of the forensic tents and called out to her. Vance hesitated, then walked over to the barrier. "You shouldn't be here, Mrs. Rothman," Vance said, but her tone was gentle rather than dismissive. "What did you find?" Helen asked. Vance glanced around, ensuring no reporters were close enough to overhear. The second chamber was smaller, accessed through a concealed passage from the main basement. It appears to have been a living quarters of sorts. "The perpetrator lived down there?" Helen's voice rose in disbelief. "With the students?" "No, the quarters were separate, completely isolated from the area where the bus was kept. But yes, it appears someone spent significant time in that facility. We found personal belongings, clothing, supplies, and more, documents." Helen waited, sensing there was something worse coming. "We also found evidence that the facility was used more than once," Vance said quietly. "There are markings on the walls, dates carved into the concrete. The earliest we've found so far is from 1987. The implications hit Helen like a physical blow. "There were others? Before Brianna and the other students?" "We don't know yet. We're expanding the search, bringing in ground-penetrating radar to scan the entire property. If there are more chambers, more victims, we need to find them." A commotion near the facility's entrance drew their attention. Several forensic technicians were emerging, carrying sealed evidence boxes. But what caught Helen's eye was the gurney being wheeled out, a black body bag strapped to it. "That's not from 1992, Helen said, noting the urgency with which the medical examiner's team was working. Vance's jaw tightened. "No, it's not." Before Helen could press for more information, Vance's phone rang again. She answered, listened, then her face went pale. "I'll be right there." She ended the call and looked at Helen with an expression of barely controlled shock. "What?" Helen demanded. "What is it?" "They found identification on the body. Driver's license still in a wallet. The person died much more recently than 1992. Vance hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "Helen, the body is Thomas Garrett." Helen's mind reeled. "The bus driver? But that's impossible. He disappeared with the students. He should have been found with them in the main chamber." "He wasn't. And according to the preliminary examination, Thomas Garrett has been dead for less than a year." The world seemed to tilt beneath Helen's feet. "He was alive? All this time, he was alive?" "It appears so, which means everything we thought we knew about this case is wrong. Garrett wasn't a victim. He was involved, possibly the primary perpetrator. And he's been free for 33 years. Helen gripped the police barrier, her legs suddenly weak. Thomas Garrett. She remembered him vaguely from 1992, a middle-aged man with a kind face, someone who waved to parents when he drove past, someone everyone had trusted with their children. "If he just died recently," Helen said slowly, "then someone else knows about this place, someone who had access to the facility even after it was abandoned." Vance nodded grimly. "We're operating under the assumption that there's at least one more person involved. Someone who either worked with Garrett from the beginning or discovered the facility afterward and continued using it." "Using it for what?" That's what we need to determine. But Helen, if Garrett died here within the past year, it means this location has been active recently. Someone has been coming here, and they might still be in Pinewood. The crowd around them had grown larger. Dozens of Pinewood residents drawn by morbid curiosity or desperate need for answers. Helen scanned the faces, wondering if the person responsible was standing among them right now, watching the investigation unfold. "The town hall meeting tonight," Vance said. "I need you there. We're going to appeal to the public for information, and we're going to reveal some of what we've found. Sometimes that pressure can make people come forward, can shake loose memories or suspicions they've been holding on to." Helen nodded, but her attention had been caught by something else. A man standing at the edge of the crowd, partially obscured by a news van. He was older, perhaps in his 70s, wearing a dark jacket despite the mild weather. But it was his expression that made Helen's breath catch. Not curiosity or horror like everyone else, but something that looked almost like satisfaction. "Detective," Helen said, grabbing Vance's arm, "that man over there by the white van. Do you know who he is?" Vance followed her gaze, but the man had already turned away, disappearing into the crowd. "I didn't get a good look. Why?" There was something about the way he was watching. Not like everyone else, like he was... Helen struggled to articulate what she'd sensed. Like he was checking on something, making sure it was being handled correctly. Vance immediately radioed for officers to canvass the crowd, to get names and identification from everyone present. But Helen suspected it was already too late. Whoever that man was, he was gone. The afternoon stretched into evening. Helen returned home to prepare for the town hall meeting, but she couldn't shake the image of that man's face from her mind. She'd seen him before. She was certain of it. But where? When? She pulled out old photo albums from 1992, flipping through images of school events, neighborhood gatherings, Brianna's birthday parties. So many faces, most of them familiar. Teachers, classmates, parents, coaches. Any one of them could have been secretly documenting Brianna's routines, planning the abduction. Her phone rang. It was Marcus Webb, his voice shaking. "Helen, I just got a call from Detective Vance. They want to talk to me about Joel, about why he stayed home sick that day." "What do you mean?" "They found medical records. Joel wasn't actually sick. I kept him home because..." Marcus's voice broke. "Because I had a bad feeling that morning. I can't explain it, but something felt wrong, and I told him to stay home. The detective thinks I might have known something, might have had some kind of warning." Helen's chest tightened. "Did you? Did someone say something to you?" "I don't know. I've been trying to remember. That whole period is such a blur of grief and guilt. But Helen, what if someone did warn me? What if I missed something that could have saved the other kids?" "Marcus, you can't think that way. If you had even the slightest suspicion, you would have told everyone. You would have stopped that bus yourself." But even as she said the words, Helen felt a cold suspicion taking root. What if the perpetrator had warned certain parents? What if Joel's absence hadn't been coincidence but design? She thought again of the crossed-out 18th name. Jennifer Hartley, someone who had been selected but never taken, someone who might have been warned, protected, spared for reasons no one yet understood. The town hall meeting was scheduled for 7 o'clock at Pinewood High School's auditorium, the only space large enough to accommodate the expected crowd. Helen arrived early, finding the parking lot already half full. She recognized many of the cars, the other parents from the support group, longtime Pinewood residents, people who had lived through the nightmare of 1992 and carried its weight ever since. Inside, the auditorium was filling rapidly. Helen took a seat near the front, wanting to see Detective Vance's face when she delivered whatever news had prompted this emergency meeting. Around her, conversations buzzed with speculation and fear. At exactly 7 o'clock, Detective Vance took the stage along with the police chief, the mayor, and two people Helen didn't recognize, a man and woman in dark suits who had FBI written all over them. "Thank you for coming," Vance began, her voice amplified through the auditorium's sound system. "I know you all have questions, and we're going to answer as many as we can tonight. But first, I need to be direct with you about what we've found." The room fell silent. The discovery at the water treatment facility has confirmed what many of you have feared for 33 years. The 17 students and their bus driver were abducted and held in a facility beneath that building. Based on the evidence we've collected, they survived for several months before succumbing to various causes that our medical examiner is still determining. A wave of anguished sounds rippled through the auditorium. Helen felt Diane Foster grip her hand from the seat beside her. "However," Vance continued, "we have also made discoveries that significantly complicate this case. The bus driver, Thomas Garrett, was not found with the students. His body was recovered from a separate chamber, and preliminary forensic analysis indicates he died within the past year." The auditorium erupted in shocked voices. Vance waited for silence before continuing. "This means Thomas Garrett was not a victim. He was either the primary perpetrator or a willing accomplice. He lived free for more than 3 decades while the families of his victims suffered." Helen watched the faces around her contort with rage and grief. Parents who had mourned Thomas Garrett alongside their own children now learned he had betrayed them all. "We are also investigating evidence that suggests the facility may have been used for other abductions prior to 1992, Vance said. "We are expanding our search and cross-referencing missing person cases from the 1980s. If you had a family member who disappeared during that time period, please contact our tip line." One of the FBI agents stepped forward. "We're asking anyone who had regular contact with Thomas Garrett to come forward. We need to build a complete picture of his life, his associates, anyone he might have worked with. We're also interested in anyone who had access to the water treatment facility after its closure in 1986. Hands shot up around the auditorium, people desperate to ask questions. Vance pointed to an older woman in the 3rd row. "Detective, if Thomas Garrett just died recently, where has he been all these years? Was he living in Pinewood this whole time?" "We're investigating that now. We have reason to believe he may have been using an assumed identity." Another hand, another question. "What about the 18th name? Who was supposed to be taken but wasn't?" Vance's expression tightened. "We're still working to identify that individual. If anyone knows someone named Jennifer Hartley who lived in Pinewood in 1992, please contact us immediately." Helen's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out discreetly and saw a text from an unknown number. "Look to your left, 3 rows back." The man in the gray jacket. Her heart hammering, Helen turned slowly. 3 rows back, sitting alone at the end of the row, was the same man she'd seen at the construction site earlier. The one who'd been watching with that strange expression of satisfaction. As if sensing her gaze, the man looked directly at her and smiled. Helen's hands trembled as she stared at the man in the gray jacket. Before she could react, he stood and walked calmly toward the exit, moving against the flow of people trying to enter. She fumbled with her phone, trying to text back to the unknown number, but a new message appeared. "Don't follow him. Not yet. He knows you're watching." Detective Vance was still fielding questions from the increasingly agitated crowd, but Helen pushed her way to the aisle and hurried toward the lobby. By the time she reached the exit, the man had vanished into the parking lot. She stood in the cool evening air, scanning the rows of vehicles, but saw no movement. Her phone buzzed again. "Meet me at the old library on Pine Street. 20 minutes. Come alone. I have information about Jennifer Hartley." Helen's instincts screamed at her not to go, to show these messages to Detective Vance immediately. But something about the texts felt urgent, genuine. And if this person truly knew about Jennifer Hartley, the one name that might unlock the entire conspiracy, she couldn't risk scaring them off. She returned to the auditorium long enough to catch Diane's eye and mouth. "I'll call you later," then slipped back out before anyone could stop her. The old library had been closed for 15 years, replaced by a modern facility near the town center. The building still stood on Pine Street, its windows dark, a "for sale" sign weathered and faded in the overgrown front yard. Helen parked across the street, her headlights illuminating the sagging porch and peeling paint. She waited, checking her mirrors, seeing no other vehicles approach. Then her phone lit up. Back door. It's unlocked. Helen's pulse hammered in her ears as she crossed the street. Every instinct told her this was foolish, dangerous. But she thought of Brianna, trapped in darkness for 4 months, and forced herself forward. The back door opened with a rusty creak. Inside, the library smelled of mold and old paper. Moonlight filtered through grimy windows, casting everything in shades of gray. Helen pulled out her phone, using its flashlight to navigate through the empty main room. "Mrs. Rothman." She spun toward the voice. A woman emerged from the shadows near what had once been the reference section. She appeared to be in her early 50s, dressed in dark clothing, her face partially obscured by a hood. "Who are you?" Helen demanded, keeping her distance. "Why did you bring me here?" "My name is Jennifer Hartley," the woman said quietly. "Or it was in 1992. I've been Jennifer Morris for the past 30 years. Helen's breath caught. "You're the 18th name, the one who was selected but not taken." Jennifer nodded, pulling back her hood to reveal a thin face with sharp features and prematurely gray hair. "I've been following the investigation since the bus was found. I knew eventually they'd discover my name in those files." "You knew about the facility? All this time?" "Not about the facility specifically. But I knew something terrible had happened, and I knew I was supposed to be part of it." Jennifer moved closer, her voice urgent. "Mrs. Rothman, I was warned. The day before the abduction, someone left a note in my locker at school. It said, 'Stay home tomorrow, don't take the bus, don't tell anyone.'" Helen felt her legs weaken. She groped for support against a bookshelf. "Who left it?" "I don't know. It wasn't signed. But I was terrified. There was something about that note. The handwriting was so precise, so cold. I showed it to my parents, and they thought I was overreacting. But they let me stay home anyway. The next day the bus disappeared." "Why didn't you come forward? Why didn't you tell the police?" Jennifer's expression twisted with shame. "I did. I went to the police station 3 days after the disappearance and showed them the note. But by then, I'd carried it in my pocket for 2 days, handled it dozens of times. The detective said it was probably just a prank, that there was no way to prove it was connected. And I was 17, Mrs. Rothman. I was terrified. What if whoever wrote that note came after me for talking?" "So you changed your name and disappeared?" "Not immediately, but yes, eventually. I couldn't stay in Pinewood knowing I'd been spared while 17 other kids died. The guilt ate at me. I moved to Seattle after graduation, changed my name when I got married, tried to build a new life. But I never forgot." Helen studied the woman's face, seeing genuine anguish there. "What brought you back now?" "Thomas. Garrett," Jennifer said. "I saw on the news that they found his body, that he'd only recently died, and I realized something that's haunted me for 33 years might actually be true." "What?" Jennifer reached into her jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. She handed it to Helen carefully, as if it might crumble. "This is the note. I kept it all these years, even though the police dismissed it. Helen unfolded the paper under her phone's light. The message was exactly as Jennifer had described, written in neat, precise handwriting. Stay home tomorrow. Don't take the bus. Don't tell anyone. But it was the handwriting that made Helen's blood run cold. She'd seen that exact same script this morning in Detective Vance's office. The same neat letters, the same spacing, the same clinical precision. This was written by the same person who kept the journals, Helen whispered. The same person who documented everything that happened in that basement. Jennifer nodded. That's what I thought. But here's what I realized recently. That handwriting is distinctive. Very distinctive. And I've seen it before, Mrs. Rothman. Not in some random place, but in Pinewood. Regularly. Where? The high school, Jennifer said. In 1992, there was a teacher who wrote exactly like this. I had him for physics my junior year. He was obsessive about neatness, about precision. He made us copy our lab reports 3 times if the handwriting wasn't perfect. And Mrs. Rothman, he drove a route home every day that passed right by the water treatment facility. Helen's mind raced. What was his name? Victor Brennan. He taught at Pinewood High for 23 years before retiring in 1995, 3 years after the abduction. The name clicked something in Helen's memory. Brianna had mentioned Mr. Brennan several times. She'd had him for chemistry her junior year. She'd said he was brilliant but strange, demanding perfection from his students, prone to keeping them after class for lengthy discussions about scientific method and behavioral psychology. Where is he now? Helen asked urgently. That's why I needed to meet you in person. I've been researching him since the news broke. Victor Brennan officially retired and moved to Portland in 1995. But there's no record of him after 1998. No credit card activity, no tax returns, nothing. He just vanished. Helen pulled out her phone to call Detective Vance, but Jennifer grabbed her wrist. Wait, there's more. I started looking into Brennan's background, and I found something disturbing. Before he came to Pinewood, he taught at a private school in Washington State. That school had 3 students disappear over a 2-year period in the early 1980s. The cases were never solved. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture more horrific than Helen had imagined. He was doing this before Pinewood, the facility being used since 1987. That was him. I think so. And I think Thomas Garrett was helping him. Garrett started driving the school bus route in 1990, 2 years before the abduction. What if Brennan recruited him specifically for this purpose? But Garrett's body was found in the facility recently, Helen said. If Brennan disappeared in 1998, who killed Garrett? Who's been using that facility? Jennifer's expression darkened. That's what I can't figure out. Unless Brennan didn't actually disappear. Unless he's been in Pinewood this whole time, hiding in plain sight. Helen thought of the man in the gray jacket, watching the investigation with that satisfied expression. Could that have been Victor Brennan, aged by 30 years, bold enough to return to the scene of his crimes? We need to tell Detective Vance all of this immediately, Helen said, already dialing. Wait, Jennifer said again. There's one more thing. When I was researching Brennan, I found an old Pinewood High yearbook online from 1992. I was looking at the faculty photos, and I noticed something strange. She pulled out her own phone, bringing up a scanned image of a yearbook page. The faculty photos were arranged in neat rows, each teacher smiling professionally for the camera. Jennifer zoomed in on Victor Brennan's photo, a man in his late 40s with thinning hair, glasses, and an unsettling intensity in his eyes even through the grainy scan. Look at the photo next to his, Jennifer said. Helen looked. The adjacent photo showed a woman labeled Patricia Brennan, school nurse. She was younger than Victor, perhaps in her late 30s, with dark hair pulled back severely and the same intense eyes. His wife, Helen said. Yes, And Mrs. Rothman, Patricia Brennan, still lives in Pinewood. I checked. She never moved to Portland. She stayed here, living in the same house on Maple Street that she shared with Victor before his supposed retirement. Helen's phone connected to Detective Vance's voicemail. She left a hurried message explaining where she was and who she'd found, then hung up and looked at Jennifer. "We need to go to the police station right now, both of us, and we need to tell them about Patricia Brennan." They made it halfway across the library's main room before the lights suddenly blazed on, flooding the space with harsh fluorescent brightness. Both women froze, momentarily blinded. "That won't be necessary," a woman's voice said from the front entrance. Helen's vision cleared, and she saw Patricia Brennan standing in the doorway. The woman looked older than her yearbook photo, her hair now completely gray, but her eyes held the same disturbing intensity. She was pointing a small pistol directly at them. "I've been following you, Mrs. Rothman," Patricia said, her voice eerily calm. "Ever since you started asking questions at that construction site. I knew eventually you'd lead me to her." She gestured with the gun toward Jennifer. The one who got away. The one Victor never stopped regretting. Helen instinctively stepped in front of Jennifer, her heart hammering against her ribs. Patricia Brennan moved further into the library, the gun steady in her hands. Her composure was unsettling, not the frantic energy of someone committing a desperate act, but the methodical calm of someone executing a long-rehearsed plan. "You killed Thomas Garrett," Helen said, trying to keep her voice level, trying to buy time for someone to respond to her voicemail to Vance. Patricia smiled thinly. Thomas was becoming a liability. All these years, he'd kept quiet, lived his pathetic little life under his new identity. But when that construction project was announced, he panicked, started talking about confessing, about finally telling the truth. He actually thought there might be forgiveness for what we'd done. "We," Jennifer whispered from behind Helen. "You were involved from the beginning?" "Of course. Did you think Victor could have managed all of this alone? The planning, the modifications to the facility, the logistics of the abduction? I was his partner in every sense of the word." Patricia's expression took on an almost dreamy quality. "We were conducting the most important psychological study of the century, creating a controlled environment to observe human behavior under extreme duress, to document the breakdown of social structures, to see how long the facade of civilization could persist in isolation." Helen felt sick. "They were children. Brianna was 17 years old." "They were perfect subjects," Patricia corrected, "carefully selected for their diverse personality types, their varying levels of intelligence and social adaptation. We needed a representative sample to make the study scientifically valid." "Where is your husband now?" Helen demanded. "Where is Victor?" Patricia's smile faded. "Victor is dead. He passed away in 2003, heart failure. A bitter irony that he dedicated his life to studying the human response to mortality and fear, only to succumb to something so banal." She paused, her grip tightening on the pistol. "But his work continues. I've maintained the facility, preserved his research, even added to it when opportunities presented themselves." The implication made Helen's stomach turn. "There were others, after 1992. "A few. Not as many as Victor would have liked, but enough to validate certain hypotheses. The facility is quite versatile, you see. It can be adapted for different experimental configurations." Jennifer's voice shook as she spoke. "Why was I spared? Why did you warn me?" Patricia's eyes flickered with something that might have been regret. "That was Victor's decision, not mine. He had become fond of you. You reminded him of his daughter from his first marriage. He couldn't bring himself to include you, so he crossed your name off the list at the last moment and sent you that warning note." She laughed bitterly. I argued against it. I said you'd become a loose end, that eventually you'd piece things together. And here we are, 33 years later, proving me right. Victor had a daughter? Helen asked, grasping at anything that might keep Patricia talking, might delay whatever she was planning. From his first wife. She died young, cancer. The daughter Caroline was institutionalized in the late 1970s. Severe mental illness, Victor always said, though I suspected it was more complicated than that. He visited her regularly until she passed away in 1989. Patricia's expression hardened. He never quite got over losing her. That's partly what drove his research, trying to understand the fragility of the human mind, the breaking points. Helen's phone buzzed in her pocket. Probably Detective Vance returning her call. Patricia noticed the movement. "Give me the phone, Mrs. Rothman." Slowly. Helen reached into her pocket, but instead of handing over the phone, she threw it hard at Patricia's face. The older woman flinched, and in that moment, Helen shoved Jennifer toward the back exit. "Run!" she screamed. A gunshot cracked through the library, deafeningly loud in the enclosed space. Helen felt something burn across her upper arm, but didn't stop moving. She and Jennifer crashed through the back door into the alley, sprinting toward Helen's car parked on the street. Behind them, Patricia emerged from the library, raising the gun for another shot. But before she could fire, police sirens wailed in the distance, growing rapidly louder. Patricia's expression twisted with frustration. She turned and ran in the opposite direction, disappearing into the darkness between buildings. Helen and Jennifer reached the car just as two police cruisers screeched to a halt in front of the library. Detective Vance jumped out of the lead car, her weapon drawn, scanning for threats. "Helen, are you hurt?" Helen looked down at her arm, seeing blood soaking through her sleeve. The adrenaline was starting to fade, and pain began radiating from the wound. "It's just a graze. She went that way, Patricia Brennan. She's armed." Vance immediately radioed the information to the other officers, who took off in pursuit. She guided Helen and Jennifer to sit on the curb while calling for an ambulance. "Patricia Brennan," Vance repeated, her face grim. "The school nurse from 1992. We ran background checks on school employees, but she was never flagged because she had no criminal record, no suspicious connections. She just faded into retirement after the facility was discovered." "She's been maintaining it," Helen said, wincing as Vance examined her wound. "She admitted to killing Thomas Garrett, and she said there were others, after the original 17 students." Jennifer pulled out the warning note she'd shown Helen earlier. "Detective, this note was written by Victor Brennan, Patricia's husband. He was a teacher at Pinewood High. I think he was the primary perpetrator, and Patricia was his accomplice." Vance took the note carefully, her expression darkening as she studied the handwriting. "This matches the journals we found. We need to get you both to the hospital and take formal statements." More police cars arrived, officers spreading out to search the surrounding area for Patricia. Vance's phone rang, and she stepped away to answer it. When she returned, her face was pale. They found Patricia's car parked 3 blocks away. In the trunk, they discovered a laptop and several boxes of documents. She was planning to run. Vance paused. They also found a list, names and addresses. 12 names, all people who were involved in the original investigation in 1992. Helen felt ice form in her stomach. She was going to kill the investigators? Why? "Because we're getting too close. Because between the forensics team's findings and what you two have uncovered tonight, we're about to expose the full scope of what the Brennans did. She's trying to eliminate anyone who might complete the investigation." An ambulance arrived, paramedics quickly assessing Helen's gunshot wound. It was indeed superficial, the bullet having merely grazed her upper arm. They cleaned and bandaged it while Vance continued coordinating the manhunt for Patricia. "Detective," one of the officers called out, jogging over from the library entrance. "We found something inside. You need to see this." They followed him back into the library, to a corner where several old filing cabinets stood against the wall. The officer had opened the bottom drawer of one cabinet, revealing not files, but a hidden compartment containing a metal box. Vance carefully opened the box. Inside were dozens of photographs, newspaper clippings, and what appeared to be identification documents. She spread them out on a nearby table, and Helen felt her breath catch. The photographs showed various people, teenagers mostly, but also some adults, in what looked like the basement facility. Different time periods, different subjects, but all showing the same clinical documentation that had characterized Victor Brennan's journals. "These are dated," Jennifer said, pointing to timestamps on several photos. "This one is from 1988, this one from 1994, and this—" She picked up a photo with shaking hands. "This is from last year." The image showed a young man, probably in his early 20s, sitting in what appeared to be the same viewing room Helen had been told about. His eyes were vacant, his expression hollow. "Patricia was still using the facility," Vance said quietly. "Even after Victor died, she continued the experiments." Helen shuffled through the photographs, her horror growing with each new image. Then she froze, pulling out a picture that made her blood run cold. The photograph showed a teenage girl, perhaps 16 or 17 years old, sitting in what looked like a classroom. But she was staring directly at the camera with an expression of such malevolent intelligence that it seemed to radiate off the photo. The caption beneath read, "Carolyn Brennan, 1976. "Victor's daughter," Helen whispered. "Patricia said she was institutionalized." Vance leaned closer. "What are you thinking?" "Patricia said Caroline died in 1989. But what if she didn't? What if that was just a cover story, like Victor's supposed move to Portland?" Helen's mind raced through the possibilities. "What if Caroline was helping them? What if she's still alive?" Jennifer picked up another photograph from the box, this one more recent. It showed two women standing in front of the water treatment facility. One was clearly Patricia Brennan. The other was younger, perhaps in her 50s, but bore a striking resemblance to the teenage girl in the 1976 photo. "Oh God," Jennifer breathed. "She's not dead. Caroline Brennan is alive, and she's been working with Patricia all these years." Vance grabbed her radio, calling for additional units. "We need to find Patricia Brennan immediately, and we need to identify and locate Caroline Brennan. These women are extremely dangerous and potentially still have access to the facility." As officers mobilized for an expanded search, Helen studied the photograph of the two women. There was something familiar about Caroline's face, something that nagged at her memory. Where had she seen this woman before? Then it hit her. Not the face exactly, but the expression. That same look of cold satisfaction she'd seen on the man in the gray jacket at the construction site and the town hall meeting. "It wasn't a man," Helen said aloud. "At the construction site, the person I saw watching, I assumed it was a man because of the clothing, the short hair. But it was Caroline. She's been monitoring the investigation this entire time, watching to see what we'd discover." Vance's expression hardened. "Then she knows exactly what we found, and she knows we're closing in." One of the officers approached, holding an evidence bag containing a set of keys. "Detective, we found these in the filing cabinet. They're labeled Facility Access and Observation Room." Vance took the keys, examining them closely. "These could be valuable. If we can determine which locks they fit, we might find other locations they were using." Helen's phone rang. Her real phone, which she'd thrown at Patricia but which officers had recovered. She answered to hear Diane Foster's panicked voice. "Helen, thank God! I just got the strangest call. A woman claiming to be a reporter, asking very specific questions about the case, about what the families know, about who's been talking to the police. But Helen, her questions were wrong. She knew details that haven't been released to the media. I think she was trying to figure out how much we've told the investigators. Did she leave a name? She said her name was Carol Bennett, but when I tried to call the number back, it was disconnected. Carol Bennett. CB Caroline Brennan. Diane, have you talked to any of the other families tonight? Has anyone else received similar calls? I don't know. I called you first. Helen relayed this information to Vance, who immediately had officers begin calling the other victims' families to warn them and see if anyone else had been contacted. Within minutes, a pattern emerged. 4 families had received calls from reporters asking suspiciously specific questions. 2 others reported seeing an unfamiliar woman parked outside their houses earlier in the evening. Caroline Brennan was actively stalking the families, trying to determine who knew what and who posed the greatest threat to her operation. She's preparing for something, Vance said grimly, either to run or to eliminate witnesses. We need to find her before she does either. As if in response to Vance's words, her phone rang. She answered, listened for a moment, then her face went white. There's been a break-in at the evidence warehouse where we've been storing everything from the facility. Security guard was knocked unconscious. They took several boxes of documents and photographs. Helen felt the situation spiraling beyond control. Patricia and Caroline Brennan were out there somewhere, armed, desperate, and now in possession of evidence that could tell them exactly how much the police knew. They're going to destroy it, Jennifer said quietly. All of Victor's research, all the documentation of what they did. They're going to burn it all and disappear. Vance shook her head. Not if we find them first. The manhunt for Patricia and Caroline Brennan intensified as midnight approached. Police set up roadblocks on all major routes out of Pinewood, while forensic teams worked through the night at both the water treatment facility and the old library. Helen refused to go to the hospital despite her injury, instead staying at the police station with Jennifer. Both women, too, keyed up to sleep. Detective Vance had set up a command center in the station's largest conference room, walls now covered with photographs, maps, and timelines spanning 33 years of horrific crimes. Helen stood before the display, studying the faces of the 17 students who had died in that basement. Brianna's school photo was positioned prominently in the center, her bright smile a painful reminder of everything that had been stolen. Mrs. Rothman, one of the officers called from across the room. We just got a hit on Caroline Brennan's vehicle. Traffic camera caught her heading east on Highway 26 about 40 minutes ago. Vance moved quickly to the monitor, studying the grainy footage. The timestamp showed 11:47 p.m. The vehicle was a dark sedan, and though the driver's face wasn't clearly visible, the license plate matched the registration they'd found in Patricia's house. She's heading toward the facility, Vance said. Why would she go back there when she knows we've been processing it for days? Helen's mind raced through the possibilities. The documents they stole from the evidence warehouse. Maybe there's something in them that references another location, another chamber we haven't found yet. Jennifer had been quiet, studying the photographs on the wall. Now she spoke up, her voice uncertain. Or maybe she's not running. Maybe she's going there to finish something. Vance turned to her. What do you mean? Victor Brennan was obsessed with completing his research, documenting everything to the last detail. Patricia said his work continued after he died. What if there's still someone in that facility? What if Caroline is going there to eliminate the final subject before we can find them? The thought sent ice through Helen's veins. We need to get there now. Within minutes, a convoy of police vehicles was racing toward the water treatment facility, sirens wailing through the empty streets of Pinewood. Helen rode in Vance's car, Jennifer beside her, both women silent as they watched the familiar landscape blur past. The facility came into view, its dark silhouette looming against the night sky. The forensic tents were still in place, but the site appeared deserted. The overnight security detail had been pulled to assist with the manhunt. Vance radioed for backup as they pulled into the lot, instructing officers to surround the perimeter. Carolyn's sedan was parked near the main entrance, its engine still ticking with residual heat. Vance drew her weapon and motioned for Helen and Jennifer to stay behind the police line, but Helen shook her head. "If there's someone still alive down there, they might need medical attention immediately. I'm coming with you." Vance looked ready to argue, but the determination in Helen's eyes must have convinced her. "Stay behind me. Do exactly as I say." They entered the facility through the main breach the demolition crew had created, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The concrete stairs leading to the basement level were still intact, and they descended carefully, the air growing colder and more oppressive with each step. The main chamber where the bus had been found was now empty, the vehicle having been transported to the state forensics lab for further examination. But the space still held traces of its gruesome history. Evidence markers dotting the floor, dark stains on the concrete that Helen tried not to think about. Vance held up a hand, signaling for silence. In the distance, they could hear voices echoing through the facility's network of corridors. 2 voices, both female, one older and one younger. They moved toward the sound, passing through the concealed doorway that led to the living quarters where Thomas Garrett's body had been found. Beyond that lay another passage, one that hadn't been on any of the architectural drawings. Someone had carved it through the concrete more recently, the edges rough and unfinished. The voices grew clearer as they approached. Patricia's voice, strained with emotion. "We can't leave her here. If they find her alive, she'll tell them everything." Caroline's response was cold, clinical. "She's already told them everything. That matters. The research is complete. She's served her purpose." Helen's breath caught. They were talking about a living person, someone still trapped in this nightmare. Vance signaled for the other officers to fan out, to surround the room before making their move. Helen could see light spilling from an opening ahead. Not the harsh glare of work lights, but the softer glow of battery-powered lanterns. They reached the entrance to what appeared to be yet another hidden chamber, this one smaller than the others. Inside, Helen could see Patricia and Caroline Brennan standing over a hospital-style bed. And in that bed, barely visible in the dim light, was a young woman. She was emaciated, her hair lank and unwashed, her eyes closed, but her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. Alive. "Police, drop your weapons," Vance shouted, stepping into the doorway with her gun raised. Patricia spun around, a syringe in her hand. Carolyn moved with surprising speed, grabbing a scalpel from a nearby tray. But they were surrounded, officers blocking every exit, weapons trained on both women. "It's over," Vance said firmly. "Step away from the bed. Put down the syringe and the scalpel." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Patricia laughed, a brittle sound that echoed off the concrete walls. "Over? You think this is over? You have no idea what Victor accomplished here. What we've learned about the human psyche, about survival, about the breaking point of consciousness itself." "You tortured and murdered children," Helen said, her voice shaking with rage as she stepped into view beside Vance. "You destroyed families. You're not scientists. You're monsters." Caroline's eyes fixed on Helen with chilling intensity. "You're Margaret Rothman's mother. Subject 12. She was one of our most interesting cases. Strong-willed, intelligent, tried to maintain hope until the very end. Father recorded her psychological decline in extraordinary detail." Helen felt bile rise in her throat, but she forced herself to meet Caroline's gaze. "Brianna. Her name was Brianna. She was a person, not a subject. She had dreams and friends and a family who loved her. Sentiment is irrelevant to scientific inquiry, Caroline replied, but something flickered in her expression. Not quite doubt, but perhaps a crack in the facade of cold rationality she'd maintained for so long. Patricia's hand tightened on the syringe. We were going to revolutionize psychology, neuroscience, our understanding of human behavior. Another 20 years and Victor's research would have been complete. Put it down, Mrs. Brennan, Vance ordered. Don't make this worse than it already is. Helen's attention had shifted to the young woman on the bed. She was stirring now, awakened by the commotion. Her eyes opened, and even in the dim light, Helen could see the terror and confusion there. How long has she been here? Helen asked, her voice barely a whisper. Carolyn tilted her head, considering. This subject? Approximately 18 months. She's proven remarkably resilient, though her cognitive function has deteriorated significantly in recent weeks. 18 months. A year and a half of captivity, of psychological torture, while Pinewood went about its daily business mere miles away. Patricia suddenly lunged toward the bed, the syringe raised. But Vance was faster, firing a single shot that struck Patricia in the shoulder. The older woman cried out and stumbled backward, the syringe clattering to the floor. Carolyn moved simultaneously, slashing at the nearest officer with the scalpel. She managed to cut his arm before two other officers tackled her, wrestling the blade away and forcing her to the ground. Within seconds, both women were in handcuffs, Patricia bleeding and cursing, Carolyn silent and coldly defiant. Paramedics rushed in to attend to the young woman on the bed, carefully disconnecting her from the various monitoring devices the Brennans had attached. Helen approached the bed slowly, looking down at the survivor. She was young, probably mid-20s, with dark hair and hollow eyes that had seen too much suffering. But she was breathing. She was alive. "What's your name?" Helen asked softly. The young woman's lips moved, her voice barely audible. Emma Chen." Vance was already on her radio. "Run a missing person search for Emma Chen, age approximately 23 to 27, likely reported missing within the past 2 years." Helen took Emma's hand gently. "You're safe now. It's over. We're going to get you to a hospital, and we're going to help you." Emma's eyes filled with tears, and she gripped Helen's hand with surprising strength. "The others," she whispered. "The others. Before me. I heard them. In the recordings. They played recordings." "We know," Helen said, her own tears falling now. "We found them. We're bringing them home." As paramedics prepared to transport Emma, Vance turned to Helen and Jennifer. "There will be more. If they kept Emma alive for 18 months, if Caroline continued Victor's work after his death, there could be other victims we haven't found yet. Other chambers, other locations." Helen looked at Patricia and Caroline, both now surrounded by officers and being read their rights. Patricia was still ranting about the importance of their research, about how future generations would understand and appreciate their work. Caroline remained silent, but her eyes tracked everything with that same cold, analytical intensity. "They'll tell us," Helen said with quiet certainty. "One way or another, they'll tell us where the others are." Dawn was breaking as they emerged from the facility, Emma Chen strapped to a gurney and surrounded by medical personnel. News crews had gathered outside the police perimeter, their cameras capturing the moment the first living victim of the Brennan experiments was brought back into the light. Helen stood with Jennifer, watching as Patricia and Caroline were loaded into separate police vehicles. 33 years of searching, of hoping against hope, had led to this moment. Not the ending Helen had wanted. Brianna was gone, lost forever in that darkness, but an ending nonetheless. "Mrs. Rothman," Detective Vance said, approaching with exhaustion etched into her features. "Emma is stable. She's severely malnourished and dehydrated, and the psychological trauma is extensive, but the doctors think she'll survive. You saved her life by putting this together tonight." Helen shook her head. Jennifer saved her. If she hadn't come forward, hadn't kept that note all these years, we never would have made the connection to the Brennans. Jennifer's eyes were distant, haunted. "I should have done more back then. Should have pushed harder when the police dismissed the note. Maybe if I had—" "You were 17 years old and terrified," Helen interrupted firmly. "This isn't on you. This is on them." She gestured toward the police cars holding Patricia and Caroline. "They made these choices. They committed these atrocities. Not you." As the sun climbed higher, casting golden light across the facility that had held so much darkness, Helen felt something shift inside her chest. Not closure exactly. There could never be true closure for what had been done to Brianna and the 16 other students. But perhaps something like resolution. The truth, however horrible, was finally coming to light. And in that hidden chamber, one person had survived. One person would live to tell their story, to testify to what the Brennans had done, to ensure their crimes would never be forgotten or dismissed. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. 6 months later, Helen Rothman stood in the newly dedicated memorial garden at Pinewood High School. 17 stone markers formed a circle around a central sculpture, an abstract representation of a school bus, crafted from polished steel that reflected the surrounding trees and sky. Each marker bore the name of a student who had died in the basement facility, along with their dates of birth and the single date they all shared, November 9th, 1992. The date they were stolen. The date their futures ended. Helen traced her fingers across Brianna's name, carved deep into the gray granite. After 6 months, the pain hadn't lessened. She doubted it ever would. But it had changed shape, becoming something she could carry rather than something that crushed her. The trial of Patricia and Caroline Brennan had concluded 3 weeks ago. Both women had been convicted on multiple counts of kidnapping, murder, and a host of other charges that would ensure they spent the rest of their lives in prison. The testimony had been brutal, the evidence overwhelming. Patricia had eventually provided information about 4 other victims held in separate locations over the years, though none of those had survived. Emma Chen had testified, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands as she described the 18 months she'd spent in captivity. The courtroom had sat in horrified silence as she explained the experiments, the isolation, the sensory deprivation, the carefully calibrated psychological torture disguised as behavioral research. But Emma had also testified to something else, the sound of voices in the darkness during her early days of captivity. Other prisoners, she now realized, though she'd thought at the time that the Brennans were simply playing recordings to disorient her. They had been the final survivors of the original 17 students, still alive in 1993 when Emma was born, their voices preserved in Patricia's meticulous audio logs. The forensic analysis had confirmed that at least some of the students had survived for nearly 6 months in that basement. 6 months of hope that someone would find them, would save them. Hope that had eventually died along with everything else. Helen heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Detective Vance approaching, holding 2 cups of coffee. She offered one to Helen, and they stood together in comfortable silence, looking at the memorial. "The city council approved the demolition of the water treatment facility," Vance said eventually. "They're going to turn the entire site into a park, a place of healing, they're calling it." Helen nodded. She'd supported the decision, as had most of the other families. The building itself was contaminated by too much suffering to be repurposed for anything else. "Emma's doing better," Vance continued. "She started a support group for survivors of long-term captivity. She's talking about going back to school, maybe studying psychology. Wants to help others who've experienced trauma. She's remarkable, Helen said. To survive what she did and still have that kind of strength. She had an advantage the others didn't, Vance said quietly. She knew people were looking for her. Her family never gave up, kept her case active, kept searching. That hope, knowing she wasn't forgotten, her therapist says that's what kept her alive. Helen thought of Brianna, trapped in that darkness, watching other students die around her. Had she known how desperately Helen was searching? Had she maintained hope until the end? Or had that hope died first? She would never know. And that uncertainty would haunt her for the rest of her life. The other families are gathering at the community center this afternoon, Vance said. There's going to be a remembrance service. Will you be there? Yes, Helen replied. We're all going together. Marcus, Diane, Raymond, all of us. We're stronger together. The support group had reformed and strengthened in the wake of the trial, meeting weekly, sharing memories of their lost children, helping each other navigate the complicated grief that came with finally knowing the truth. It didn't make the pain go away, but it made it bearable. Jennifer Hartley had become a regular member of the group as well. Her guilt at surviving had been overwhelming at first, but the other parents had embraced her, recognizing that she too was a victim of Victor Brennan's calculated cruelty. She'd established a scholarship fund in honor of the 17 students, supporting teenagers interested in pursuing careers in mental health and victim advocacy. Helen's phone buzzed with a text from Diane. Are you coming to the service? We're saving you a seat. On my way, Helen typed back. Before leaving, she placed a single white rose at the base of Brianna's memorial stone. She'd done this every week for the past 6 months, would probably do it every week for the rest of her life. It was a small ritual, a way of maintaining connection with the daughter she'd lost. I love you, sweetheart, Helen whispered. I never stopped looking. I never gave up hope. And I promise, your story will never be forgotten. A breeze stirred the trees surrounding the memorial garden, and for just a moment, Helen could almost hear Brianna's voice carried on the wind. Love you too, Mom. She knew it was just her imagination, just the desperate wish of a grieving mother. But she held on to it anyway, that small moment of imagined connection, as she walked back toward her car. The community center was filled when Helen arrived. Not just the families of the 17 students, but hundreds of Pinewood residents who had been touched by the tragedy in some way. Former classmates of the victims, now in their 40s and 50s. Teachers who had lost students. People who simply wanted to acknowledge the horror that had festered in their town for so long. The service was simple, but moving. Each family was given time to speak about their lost child, to share memories and dreams that had been cut short. Marcus Webb spoke about his daughter Ashley's love of music. Raymond Kirk described his son Nathan's artistic talent. Diane Foster showed photographs of her quiet, thoughtful boy who had always been drawing in his sketchbook. When it was Helen's turn, she walked to the podium with a folder containing some of Brianna's high school essays, assignments about her dreams of becoming a veterinarian, about her love of science, about her hopes for the future. Brianna was 17 when she was taken from us, Helen began, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. She was bright and kind and determined. She wanted to help animals, to make a difference in the world. She never got that chance. She paused, looking out at the sea of faces. But Emma Chen survived, and Emma is going to help people, going to make the difference that Brianna and the others never could. In that way, maybe their legacy continues. Maybe their stolen futures aren't entirely lost. The applause was soft, respectful. Helen returned to her seat, and Diane squeezed her hand. The service concluded with the lighting of 17 candles, one for each lost student. as the flames flickered in the dimming afternoon. Light. The gathered crowd sang a hymn that had been popular in 1992, a small connection to that lost time. Afterward, as people mingled and shared stories, Helen found herself approached by a young woman she didn't recognize. The woman was in her early 30s, with kind eyes and a professional demeanor. "Mrs. Rothman, I'm Dr. Sarah Mitchell. I'm a forensic psychologist working with the prosecution on the Brennan case." Helen shook her hand. "Is there new evidence?" "Not exactly. But I wanted to speak with you about something we found in Victor Brennan's personal journals, separate from the experimental logs. He kept a private diary, and there's an entry from March 1993, near the end of when the students were still alive." Helen felt her chest tighten. "What did it say?" Dr. Mitchell pulled out a tablet, bringing up a scanned image of handwritten text. He wrote about feeling conflicted for the first time in his life, questioning his methodology. And he mentioned one subject specifically. Subject 12, Brianna. He wrote that she reminded him of what his daughter Caroline had been like before her mental illness emerged. Intelligent, compassionate, strong. "Why are you telling me this?" Helen asked, not sure she wanted to hear more. "Because of what he wrote next. Subject 12 maintains remarkable resilience even as conditions deteriorate. She continues to encourage the younger subjects, shares her food rations, creates games and stories to maintain morale. If circumstances were different, I believe she would have become an exceptional scientist. I find myself wishing I could have mentored her properly rather than using her for this study. Perhaps that is a sign that I am finally becoming too old for this work." Helen's vision blurred with tears. He recognized her potential. He knew what he was destroying, and he did it anyway. "Yes," Dr. Mitchell said gently. "But I thought you might want to know that Brianna fought until the end, that she maintained her humanity, her compassion, even in the darkest circumstances. That's the person you raised, Mrs. Rothman. That's your daughter's true legacy." After Dr. Mitchell left, Helen stood alone in the corner of the community center, processing this new information. Brianna had been a leader even in that nightmare, had tried to maintain hope for others even as her own hope faded. It was exactly what Helen would have expected of her daughter. And somehow, that made the loss both more painful and more bearable. As the gathering wound down, Helen walked outside into the cool evening air. The sky was painted in shades of orange and purple, the sun setting over Pinewood. Somewhere in the distance, a school bus drove past, its yellow paint bright against the darkening horizon. Helen watched it disappear around a corner, carrying students home to their families. Safe. Normal. Unaware of the horror that had unfolded in their town, or the price that had been paid for the safety they now enjoyed. She pulled out her phone and looked at the photo she'd set as her wallpaper, Brianna at 17, smiling in front of the red Cadillac, full of life and hope and dreams for the future. "You are loved," Helen whispered to the image. "You are loved. You will always be loved." And as she walked to her car to drive home to her empty house, Helen carried that love with her, a flame that would never be extinguished no matter how much darkness had tried to destroy it. The truth had finally come to light. Justice, imperfect though it might be, had been served. And 17 names that had been nearly forgotten were now permanently etched in stone, in memory, in the collective conscience of a town that would never forget what had been lost. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was all Helen had. And so she held on to it, held on to the memories and the love and the small comfort of knowing that Brianna's story, all 17 stories, would be remembered, honored, and never allowed to fade into silence. That was the promise Helen had made 33 years ago, standing at her kitchen window watching Brianna board the bus for the last time. And it was a promise she intended to keep for the rest of her life.